The day after Christmas, December 26, 2004, many of you probably remember this, a massive tsunami with waves up to 100 feet high struck the surrounding coast off the Indian Ocean, killing over 230,000 people in 12 different countries. It was the deadliest natural disaster of the 21st century, one of the deadliest natural disasters recorded in history, and the worst tsunami disaster in history. Raise your hand if you remember this. Understandably so, in the following weeks, whenever something beyond horrific happens like this, lots of articles, news stories are published. I want to mention two titles that bubbled up after those days. One was titled this: Disaster Ignites Debate. Was God in the tsunami? Or simply, as an opinion article in the New York Times was titled, Where Was God? Where was God? These articles and many others like them, and you could just Google this, there's hundreds, force us to ask a question that for thousands of years, philosophers, theologians, but not just people in ivory towers ask. Every human being will ask, regardless of if you're a Christian or not. All the religions, faith systems will ask this question, and it has been dubbed the problem of evil. The problem of evil. And here's how it's framed. It's framed different ways, but one reporter, literally from one of the articles I just quoted, she put it this way: if God is God, he's not good. If God is good, he's not God. You can't have it both ways, especially after the Indian Ocean catastrophe. Again, this is what philosophers have called the problem of evil, namely, how can an all-good, all-loving God, an all-powerful God allow evil and suffering to happen? That is the question that we are diving into this morning in our God Questions series. And I know it's a pretty depressing Mother's Day sermon. Many churches will kind of do this flowery, feel-good mimosa sermon, whatever that means. I don't know if mimosas are your thing or not. So I apologize, Mom. This isn't one of those messages. You know what? But I also don't apologize in the sense of one of our values here. We want to go deep. We want to ask the real questions that people ask. We want to ask the questions that non-Christians are asking. And so this morning, like if you're new, we are jumping into like the deep end of the pool. And whether you like it or not, you're going to leave here, honestly, with like some philosophy training. And I actually think this will provide some good conversation at the brunch table with Mom, way more important than cozy flowers or mimosas, but like the meaning of life, things of that nature. And because of that also, there's just no way I can attempt to give a response to this question in one Sunday. So this is actually a two-part series within a series. So this morning is part one on the problem of evil. Come back next Sunday for part two. This morning is going to be a little bit more philosophical. And then next Sunday is going to be really, really, really Jesus-y and probably a little bit more pastoral. So here's the fascinating thing as we begin this now. This is not a question that just Christians ask. It's a question that non-Christians actually in some ways ask more, but one thing that gets left out is that this is a question and a topic that actually the Bible asks. And a lot of Christians aren't aware of that. And one of the things that I want us to grab a hold of in this series is that it is a good thing to ask questions. It is an okay thing to express doubt. Like, you don't have to have everything figured out to follow Jesus. The Bible itself models voicing and expressing doubt and questions to the God of the universe. And so as kind of like our anchoring passage this morning, I'm going to read a chapter out of the book of Job. And by the way, it's called Job, not Job, but spelled J-O-B. I just want to save you some embarrassment there to begin with. But if you're unfamiliar with the book of Job, honestly, quick summary is this. It's about a dude named Job who's a really righteous, religious person. He's a God-fearing individual. Like, he's a great dude. He's a saint. But Job, he loses his family. He loses his possessions, his wealth. He loses his physical health. He loses everything. He experiences and witnesses horrific evil and suffering, such that literally the name Job itself in Hebrew means suffering. How would you like for your mom to name you Suffering? Hey, what's your name? Suffering. But this is the book of Job, and this is the book that's in the Bible. And it's actually a pretty massive book. And of course, I don't have the time to read the whole thing for you, but here's what I want to do is I just want to offer you like the tone, the posture of this book as we begin to wrestle with this question, which is, how can a good and all-loving God, who's also all-powerful, why does he allow or permit evil and suffering? So let's turn to the book of Job. Just one chapter, Job chapter 24. If you don't have a Bible this morning, there are free ones underneath your chairs. I'm going to read from chapter 24, page 358. And notice right away, Job begins with two questions. Why does the Almighty not set times for judgment? Why must those who know him look in vain for such days? In other words, the problem of evil. God, why is there evil and suffering? This is how Job starts the chapter. And then notice what he describes. Verse 2. Remember, this is an agricultural farming community. There are those who move boundary stones. They pasture flocks they have stolen. They drive away the orphan's donkey, and they take the widow's ox in pledge. They thrust the needy from the path, and they force all the poor of the land into hiding. Like wild donkeys in the desert, the poor go about their labor of foraging food. The wasteland provides food for their children. They gather fodder in the fields, and they glean in the vineyards of the wicked. Lacking clothes, they spend the night naked. They have nothing to cover themselves in the cold. They are drenched by mountain rains, and they hug the rocks for lack of shelter. The fatherless child is snatched from the breast. The infant of the poor is seized for a debt. That would be called child slavery. Lacking clothes, they go about naked. They carry the sheaves, but they still go hungry. They crush olives among the terraces. They tread the wine presses, yet they suffer thirst. And how's verse 12? The groans of the dying rise from the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out for help. But God charges no one with wrongdoing. So here you have this biblical character, Job, whose name means suffering, who sees all of these terrible, horrific injustices, some of them done to him and his family, and others that he witnesses. And again, what are they? In case you missed it, it's the naked shivering in the cold of the night, fatherless babies snatched from their mothers, field workers who are harvesting and working hard but can't eat the food because others take it and thus they starve, and groans rising from the dead and wounded. And if that's not enough, let me read a passage from one other book in the Old Testament. This book's called Lamentations. It's another book like Job that we don't all that much read because they're kind of depressing reads. Lamentations also has a special meaning in Hebrew, just like Job. Lamentations means how. Meaning, how, God, could you allow this evil to happen? Literally, it means how. All this evil around me, how can you let this happen, God? Again, the tone of this. Let me just read 2 verses. Lamentations chapter 2, verses 11 through 12. My eyes fail from weeping. I'm in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed. Because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. And they say to their mothers, where is bread and wine? As they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their lives ebb away in their mother's arms. So, here you have these biblical authors who witness absolutely horrific, tragic evil and suffering, and they voice that. This is the key thing. They voice and express that in protest to God. And you take a step back and you realize, well, hold on. Apparently, the ancients witnessed horrific, terrible evil, but they also believed in God at the same time. I mean, we know that they believe in God because they're voicing their protest to him, signifying that they still believe in him. Like you don't talk to God unless you believe in God. If you don't think God exists, there's no point talking to him. So how? Why are these ancients able to hold this tension, namely horrific evil, like kids dying, but at the same time, they still believe in their loving and good and powerful God? How do they keep this in tension? And for this, I want to introduce you to an insect. Seriously, a type of fly called no-see-ums. This makes complete sense, right? Like this is where you saw the sermon going. Anybody here ever hear about no-see-ums? Oh, okay, decent amount of people. They're usually, from my understanding, in like hot and humid places. So here's a no-see-um, extremely magnified. And you may be wondering, A, is he really being serious when he says no-see-um? Yes, Google it. That is their name, no-see-um. Why? Next picture. You can't see them. No-see-um. Very, very clever name that scientists love to give insects and bugs and flies. So they're a type of fly. Some people think they're mosquitoes. They're not. Although, some of those mosquitoes are coming back out. I got some bites. So here, check this out. There's a good illustration with no-see-ums that comes from Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God, which I didn't check after the 9 a.m. I don't know if there's more copies back there. It was a resource book. This book, first of all, I think is one of the best books on addressing skepticism. And he has one chapter just on this issue of the problem of evil and suffering. Highly recommend it. He uses this illustration from a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. I told you, you're going to leave this morning a philosopher. And here, we'll put this up. He writes this. This is the illustration. And you'll see why I put up a random bug. If you look into your pup tent for a St. Bernard and you don't see one, it is reasonable to assume that there is no St. Bernard in your tent. Stop right there. Pup tent, I was unfamiliar with that. Just think about, like those dog houses, tents, igloos in your backyard if you have a big dog. St. Bernard, massive dog. Anybody here have a St. Bernard? Okay. Wasn't there a movie, St. Bernard? What was it? Yes, Beethoven. You like that one, Shay? Okay. So if you got Beethoven in your backyard and you got a igloo hut, whatever, for your dog, and you look inside and you don't see the St. Bernard, it's very reasonable to assume that the St. Bernard is not in there, yes? All right, let's continue on. But if you look into your pup tent for a no-see-um, an extremely small insect with a bite out of all proportions to its size, their bites hurt, by the way, and you don't see any, it is not unreasonable to assume that they aren't there. Because after all, no one can see them. Many assume that if there were good reasons for the existence of evil, they would be accessible to our minds, more like St. Bernards than like no-see-ums. But why should that be the case? Meaning, this point is this. Just because you can't come up with a good reason as to why evil or suffering is happening to you or others in our world doesn't mean that maybe God doesn't have a reason for it. Just because you can't understand it, because you can't see it, doesn't mean necessarily that a good reason doesn't exist. Just because you look into a dog tent and you don't see any no-see-ums doesn't mean that they're not there. You're not going to be able to see them. You're not going to be able to sense them. So it doesn't mean that they're not in there. This is why many philosophers today, whether Christian or not, it doesn't matter their bias or their worldview, they have come to believe philosophically now that the problem of evil, as it's been traditionally dubbed, no longer automatically disproves the existence of God. Because maybe God has reasons that we can't see or understand right now for evil. You can't count that out. If you believe that this world is full of pointless evil, actually, hang with me here, tucked within that is a premise, is that if evil appears pointless to you, well, then it must be pointless. But that isn't necessarily the case. Now, let's go back to Job and Lamentations and the ancients. C.S. Lewis, I've shared this before. It's very helpful. You know, we, especially as Americans, it isn't an American thing, but just moderns in general, we think we're very smart, and we think that we can explain everything, that we know it all, okay? And so we look back at the ancients, people who lived thousands of years ago, and we think that they were stupid and gullible, and now we know better. Lewis calls this chronological snobbery. Many of us act like that. But I don't think the ancients were stupid. I think they're actually quite smart. I told the 9 a.m., I actually just came across a thing a couple months ago, a study, that many people are actually saying right now that our IQs are dropping. So we're literally actually becoming dumber, not smarter. Now, this is a side note, and most will say it's because of smartphones, that the human mind now, like, we just do everything on our screen and we've lost the ability. That's a whole other conversation. But so actually, we're becoming dumber now, not smarter. But I think the ancients had something that we lack: humility and a willingness to embrace mystery. Things that we acknowledge that we are finite, and so our finite minds are not going to be able to understand everything. And that is so hard for us moderns because we don't like mystery today. We think that we can and should understand everything. But here's an interesting thing to think about. Do you know that even scientists today, the so-called really smart people, you know that they embrace mystery and not understanding everything? What do I mean? And if this goes over your head, it goes over my head, but just understand the point. There are things called like quantum physics or string theory, black holes, dark energy, all this crazy, bizarre stuff that scientists totally believe in rationally, but like they can't explain it. Their minds, we have a hard time understanding string theory, just Google it, but like we can't explain it. There is mystery there. A scientist will tell you that about the most complicated things of life. Which leads me to this. I think the very definition of evil itself, Like if we have to ask, like, what is evil? It's an interesting thing to ask. I think evil is things that don't make sense. Evil means chaos. We call something evil because we can't understand, like we can't wrap our minds around why would a child get sexually abused? How could a tsunami wipe out 230,000 people? Like it's what? Like this is crazy. This is chaotic. We don't know how to react. Our minds are so in grief that it's like the mind-blown emoji thing. We don't understand it. And to me, that is actually almost the definition of evil. It's when something's so bad that it doesn't add up. We can't understand it. We can't comprehend it. But check this out. Tim Keller writes this, again, in The Reason for God. If you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in the world, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue that you can't know. Indeed, you can't have it both ways. Read that again. If you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in the world, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue that you can't know. Indeed, you can't have it both ways. Have you ever wondered, why do these biblical authors like Lamentations or the character of Job, this is a question I ask all the time, why didn't they abandon their faith when they were experiencing all this horrific evil? Like, why did they just put in the towel like, yeah, God doesn't exist, there's no way? I mean, they are expressing their doubt, their grief, their anger, their bitterness, but they never abandon their trust in God. Even when they didn't understand why or how this evil was happening. What if they were onto something? What if they were okay not understanding or fully comprehending why a good and loving and all-powerful God can allow suffering because they knew perhaps, that evil was actually the evidence for the existence of God? Whoa, hold on, Mark. You're saying that perhaps the existence of evil is the evidence for God. Yes. And I think this is what the ancients were getting at. Rather than evil and suffering being evidence against God, I think evil and suffering, if anything, is actually evidence for God. So think about this. Imagine with me that no God exists, okay? Meaning this. The only thing that exists is just something that we can touch, taste, smell, hear. If I left out the fifth sense, whatever it is. Okay? Material reality, physical reality is all there is. There is no spiritual reality. There is no kind of, divine mind that created this whole world and is behind it. Nope. It's just physical stuff is here. And we are here because we've evolved over time, not guided by some divine mind. And so what got us to this point is solely the survival of the fittest. The strong have survived, and that's why us humans are here, because our genetics are superior to every other creature in nature. So assume all of that. Now, in that framework, in that worldview, you got to ask this. How do you determine and call something evil? Who's in charge of saying that's good and that's bad? Who determines that? Again, in that worldview, nature says, well, the strong are the good, they're the ones that survive, and the weak, they're the ones that die off. It's survival of the fittest, which means this. If there's a group of people, a culture, and a ethnicity, whatever, that the strong, that the majority thinks is inferior or weak, whatever, they can kill them, and that is fine. Why? Because it's survival of the fittest. The strong win, and the weak die. So think about something like World War II, the Holocaust. That's exactly what the Germans thought of the Jews. This is an inferior race. We're superior, so we're going to eliminate 5 million of them. If there is no God, who's to say that's wrong? Now, you can say it's wrong, sure, but on what? How do you justify it? Who's right? It's just whoever the strong are and have the majority of that civilization. What about the Rwandan genocide in the 90s? Here's the problem. Christian or not, you can be a Buddhist, you can be an atheist, a Muslim, whatever. We know in our bones that evil exists, that some things are bad and wrong and suffering's real. We know, I've never met any human being who thinks, oh yeah, the Holocaust, yep, you know what, that was the inferior race, so, hey, the strong win, it's okay. No, we are filled with outrage at that. It's not a Christian thing, it's a human thing. We know in our bones that no evil exists. There is objective good and bad, right and wrong. In other words, we live with an ought. We know that some things ought not to be. Humans ought not, I don't even know if that's good English grammar, ought not to die. You ought not to do that. An innocent person ought not to be charged as guilty. There's a right and a wrong. So we believe that there's justice and injustice, and we get angry, or at least we should, when there is injustice, when there is tragedy. An innocent person doesn't deserve to die. That person shouldn't experience cancer, or that child shouldn't be sexually abused. That's not right. That's not fair. You can't do that. But if there is no God, says who? Come to my house like this morning at 6:30 in the morning, my 5-year-old Eden, screaming and yelling at her 7-year-old brother, you've had too much screen time, it's my turn. That's not fair. So it's even in superficial things here. We don't have to be just talking about massive tragedies. Go to a kid's playground. You're going to hear them say, that's not fair. Where does that come from? If there is no objective moral code to the universe, if there is no God, then there's no ultimate good and evil. Good and evil are simply what? They're either an illusion, or they're just simply the preference of the majority. But how does that play out? Well, it means the weak lose. We know in our bones that's not right. So evil is real. Some things are bad, some things are good. Justice is a real thing, injustice is a real thing. Some things ought not to happen. And if that is the case, let's bring this full circle. All of a sudden, the problem of evil is more of a problem for someone who doesn't believe in God. Because if you don't believe in God, then there is no such thing as objective evil. You can say good and bad, but that's just a preference. It's not real. Maybe to help us some more. So maybe you've heard of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century. Here's a little bio on him. British professor at Oxford and Cambridge, which automatically classifies him as brilliant. Sounds brilliant, and then he teaches at 2 world-class universities. Here's the thing you gotta know about C.S. Lewis, though, is that he was an atheist. Lewis, he would hang out with another giant called J.R. Tolkien, and they would sip pints together at the British pub. I've actually been to literally like their table. You can go see it. It was where Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. Lewis famously wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. And did you know that it was there that Lewis would make arguments against God. And his whole argument against God was actually the problem of evil and suffering. It's not fair. There's too much evil here. There's no way the Christian God could exist. But actually, the more that he wrestled with it, the more he thought about it, he realized, hold on, this isn't just a problem for the Christian, this is a problem for the atheist. But then he went further and he was like, I actually think this is more of a problem for the atheist. So he wrote this famous classic book called Mere Christianity. I don't know if we still have it out there. It's also another book at the resource table. I want to quote from it, though. He writes this. This is a famous line. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. And because it's Mother's Day and moms, I just want to give you an extra treat this morning. I'm going to go the extra mile for you. I'm going to quote you another philosopher. Alvin Plantinga, one of the premier philosophers of the 20th century, also happened to be a Christian. He writes this. Could there really be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if there were no God and we just evolved? I don't see how. There can be such a thing only if there is a way that rational creatures are supposed to live, obliged to live. A secular way of looking at the world has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort, and thus no way to say there is such a thing as genuine and appalling wickedness. Accordingly, if you think there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness, and not just an illusion of some sort, then you have a powerful argument for the reality of God. The problem of evil is a problem for everyone, including Christians. I mean, Job and Lamentations show the problem. The point, though, is it's actually a bigger problem if you don't believe in God. Because if you don't believe in God, then you really can't say that evil is objective, that some things are naturally wrong. And we just know in our bones that no, some things are absolutely wrong. There's also the problem of good. I won't get into that. But just think about this. If there's no God, then why are there good things? It's very interesting. I was reading this last week. So in this conversation, it's very common for skeptics to go to something like the Holocaust. World War II, Hitler, you have 5 million Jews just murdered. And so a lot of people will say, hey, look, something like the Holocaust, that proves that God doesn't exist. How could God allow such a tragedy to happen? Same thing with the tsunami. There's this American rabbi, very, very, very interesting. His name is Dr. Reeve Robert Brenner. He did this. I think he did this in the 80s or 90s. He surveyed hundreds of Holocaust survivors, hundreds of Jews who were in concentration camps, okay? So these are people who, front and center, I mean, you talk about horrific evil. This is the worst stuff. He surveyed these followers, and he asked them this. Hey, I want to learn and I want to compare, what were your religious beliefs when you went into the Nazi ghetto? And then what are they after? Decades after. Meaning, did this horrific evil change your faith system? That's what he was getting at. Now, most of the respondents, over half, said there was no change. So whatever they were before they got sent into a concentration camp is what they came out of it as, okay? So whether that was an atheist or Christian or Jewish, whatever it was, their faith didn't change, which is, it kind of makes sense. Here is a fascinating thing of this study, though. 5% of the Holocaust survivors in his survey had abandoned atheism and begun to believe in God as a direct result of their experience in the Nazi ghettos. Now, 5% probably seems like a very small number to you, and in some sense it is. But you got to take that 5% and then project it onto all the European Jews who experienced the horrors of that. And when you do that, it basically equals 177,000 people, meaning this: 177,000 people, real people, experienced the worst of humanity, and it led them to God. If 177,000 people gave their lives to God today, what would we call that? Revival, exactly. Like that would be on the news. Like the church would be screaming and celebrating. Oh my gosh, revival. 177,000 people gave their life to Jesus. Yeah. That's what happened because they experienced the reality of evil. Now, I'd be confident that nobody here is a Holocaust survivor. But I'm just as confident that most of you in here right now have experienced or are experiencing some type of evil and suffering, and you are questioning and perhaps doubting whether God is real. Maybe you're facing bankruptcy. You have huge financial issues. Maybe your marriage is on the verge of divorce. Maybe you have or know of a 3-year-old with brain cancer. Maybe you have a friend or a family member that was killed because of a drunk driver hit them. Maybe you have a cousin, a nephew, or someone that knows someone who actually literally died, was one of the hundreds of thousands of people who died from the tsunami in 2004. See, this discussion, it starts off as a philosophical discussion, but it is not just a philosophical discussion in a stale ivory tower in a lecture hall. No, this is everyday, real life. And I have a pastoral obligation that even if you haven't experienced suffering yet, you will. It is inevitable. So, for those of you who right now, I want to talk to you, if you're going through evil and suffering right now and you're questioning God, here's what I want you to hear from me. That's okay. It's okay for you to express and voice your doubts, your anger, your bitterness, your grief to God. That sounds irreligious to say, Mark. No, it's actually very religious today. It's very biblical because that's exactly what Job and Lamentations did. They voiced in protest and asked the question, how can this be? And then that got recorded for us in 2 books in the Old Testament. Do you know that actually the largest genre in the book of Psalms are called Psalms of Lament, which means basically King David saying how mad he is at God? And those are worship songs. I mean, if we actually do believe that God is good and loving and powerful, like if we actually do believe that, Christians should be the people who are most outraged in the face of evil and suffering. We should voice our outrage because we do believe that God is good, that he created this place and he is powerful, and so evil and suffering don't come from him. We should be outraged because we know that life ought not to be full of cancer, of murder. God didn't create cancer. God's will is not cancer. God didn't create murder. His will's not people dying. God's will wasn't my dad dying of a heart attack in his early 70s. No, that ought not to have happened. And my question is, honestly, again, I'm sorry, I know it's not a Mother's Day thing. Are you outraged at evil and suffering? Seriously. Christians should be the most outraged people in the face of injustice. And my problem sometimes with the church, not the bridge, but Christians in general, is that we let secular people care more about injustice than we do. That shouldn't be the case. I mean, they don't even believe, they shouldn't even believe in morals, but they're actually mad at immoral things. It's crazy. I mean, this is why practically, we're sending a team to Kenya in 3 weeks. Why? Because we want to partner with an organization that says no to poverty in slums in Nairobi. This is why next year we're already in the books of planning trips to Mexico to build houses to help those who are in impoverished communities, because we want to say no. It shouldn't be that way. This is why on the first Saturday of the month, we have a team that goes to Pomona to hand out food and sanitary items and other things, because we want to say no to homelessness. Life shouldn't be that way, because there is a good, all-powerful, and loving God. And here's the other thing. Sorry, I'm going to go off a little bit here, but not sorry. Man, sometimes in Christian culture, we do a bad job with this in the face of evil and suffering, because we develop all these trite, cliche, stupid Christian stuff. Oh, I hear this all the time at funerals, and it's changed the way I do funerals, and I will correct people. Well, he or she's in a better place now. Well, let me tell you about heaven and the resurrection of the dead. The end game is here. God resurrects our bodies, and he designed my dad to be in a body, and doggone it, when Jesus comes back and he resurrects, my dad will be in a physical body here. This is his home, because God said it was, and he created it to be. Oh, let me just send prayers your way. Or God has a plan for your life. Oh, this is God's will for your life. Really? God's will is for cancer? God's will is for women to be raped? That's not the Bible I read. I don't know which one you're reading. Oh, just send prayers your way. Now, I got to say this. I get the heart and motivation behind those things. I get it. And there is some truth in there, right? But what I'm saying is, that's not the way life should be. Death and cancer and poverty and racism and rape and whatever other thing is not the way it ought to be. So, when you're suffering, do you stuff your emotions? Or do you offer cliche Christian platitudes? Or do you mourn and grieve and are outraged by evil? What did Jesus say? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who offer Christian cliche platitudes, for they shall be. No, that's not what it says. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Do you do that? I think there's so much emotional unhealth because people don't process grief. Do you mourn and grieve in the face of evil and suffering? I mean, this is not even my notes. It's like, why do you think professions, like law enforcement, struggle with such mental stuff? It's because they see horrific evil, and a lot of times they're not able to process it. This is very important stuff. And so whether it's suffering of yours or suffering around you or suffering across the world, followers of Jesus should grieve. Now listen to this though. We just, as the Apostle Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 14, we don't grieve like the rest of mankind. It doesn't say we don't grieve. It says we don't grieve like the rest of mankind, who what? Have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again. So we grieve, but not like the rest of the world who has no hope. Well, why is our grief different, Mark? Because we have hope. Well, what's our hope? That Jesus was risen again on the third day. And that's why I got to say, come back next Sunday, part 2, and I'm going to unpack how Jesus' death and resurrection is the ultimate answer and the defeat of evil. And so I need you to sit in that tension at least for 7 more days, all right? I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. If I can invite the worship team up. If you're on our prayer team, if I can invite you up as well. If I can have everyone stand, please. You know, like I said, this starts as a philosophical question, but it certainly doesn't end that way, because I know that there's a lot of you in the trenches of suffering right now. And what I want you to know is that you are not alone. You can't follow Jesus alone. You got to do it in community. And there's this thing in the scriptures that Paul talks about us carrying each other's burdens. Our duty as the church is, if you're suffering, is to join you and to come alongside you in that. And I want to offer that right now. If you're in suffering, just come forward. These are safe people over here. They just want to pray with you and for you and over you. To be the hands and feet of Jesus. It may not solve your problem right now, but it will bring the nearness and presence of Jesus, because one of the things that we're going to look at next week is that we serve a God who doesn't stand afar. He actually wrote himself into a story where he suffered himself so that he could relate to us, and then so that he could reverse and redeem it. We love to say this prayer. If you're new here, it's 3 words. It's come, Holy Spirit. It's a prayer of humility. It's a prayer of mystery. That there's a God of this universe who's intimately involved in us, who loves you, and he's powerful. And you may be going through some junk right now, but he's not aloof. He wants to meet you right in the middle of it. And the proof that he loves you is the cross. And the proof that he will solve it this side or next side of eternity is the resurrection. And so we grieve, but not as those without hope. Come, Holy Spirit, minister to us, breathe your life in us, Jesus.